Spider-Man Far From Home has recently released, and I'm going to compare it to the other Spider-Man sequels in their respective franchises and find out which of the movies is the superior sequel. Let the battle commence. The story and tone for these Spider-Man sequels are very different. Spider-Man 2 is a drama, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a lot of things, and Spider-Man Far From Home is a road trip comedy with one element of drama, that being Peter dealing with the weight of Tony Stark's death. One thing they all have in common though is that Peter Parker is going through a personal struggle. Now Spider-Man 2 is very much a full-on character study that explores how Peter deals with the fact that he's no longer a superhero anymore, something that pretty much every superhero runs into at some point, as well as the fact that he wants to get with Mary Jane. Of course. In The Amazing Spider-Man 2, he's suddenly struggling with the promise he's breaking to Gwen's dad, as well as finding out the truth about his parents. And in Far From Home, Peter has to take up the mantle and actually become Spider-Man, as well as worrying about whether or not he will get with MJ. Of course. Although I will say that the way Far From Home handles the romance between Peter and MJ was a lot better in this movie, and although it didn't feel deep, it was done well enough to the point that you cared. Unlike the relationship in Spider-Man 2. Now that being said, Spider-Man 2 commits all the way with his superhero struggles and goes very in depth. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, however, is all over the place, not covering much of anything, and therefore rushing its many storylines. And Far From Home only properly focuses on Peter's struggle in only one scene of the movie, and this scene happens well over an hour into the film, and then it quickly moves on and Peter is suddenly over it. That was my biggest problem with Peter dealing with Stark's death. The trailers had you believe that a big part of this movie would be that Peter is emotionally struggling to deal with the fact that his mentor and father figure is dead and no longer here to support him, and on top of that, he also has to live up and take over from his father figure and save the city, despite the fact that he has yet to get over his own emotional demons. And that would have been an amazing movie if that is what they actually went with, but no, they sidelined that fantastic and ingenious character study so they can prioritize a high school comedy movie instead, and we technically got that the last time with Spider-Man Homecoming. So Far From Home is not elevating the story of Spider-Man to new heights, it's just staying in his comfort zone and has Peter going on yet another high school romance story. And that's a shame, because if Homecoming was treated as a movie where we see Peter as a normal everyday kid, and then Far From Home came in and forced Peter to wear his big boy pants, then I would actually respect these movies for trying to climb up the ladder of maturity in each film. But instead, the trailer and advertising promised that it would take those steps, and then when I came and paid to watch the movie, it climbed all the way down. Now when Far From Home did tackle this emotional theme, it wasn't just good, it was really good, but it was short-lived as it came and went very quickly. And this missed opportunity is my biggest problem with the story for Spider-Man Far From Home. It had a greatly set up emotional story for Peter to go through, and rather than committing to it, it spent most of the time ignoring it. Now Spider-Man 2 tackled this emotional theme of Peter dealing with the fact that he's not Spider-Man, and to me, this storyline is the best part of the movie, because it establishes and heavily commits with this emotional theme throughout the whole film, and it came out swinging because of it. Now you might notice that there is one story that we haven't talked about, and that is The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and there's a reason for that. The main one is that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 has so many storylines going on that you could actually make a whole comic book series out of it. I'm going to count them down, and believe it or not, but the following storylines I am about to explain are all from The Amazing Spider-Man 2. The first plot point of the movie is that Peter is feeling guilty about going against the promise he made to Gwen's dad. The second is the relationship between him and Harry. The third is that he is trying to figure out the mystery surrounding his parents. The fourth is that he still wants to be in a relationship with Gwen despite making the decision that he should not be in a relationship with her. His Aunt May is also having financial issues and now has to work in the hospital. We also have the plot surrounding Max Dillon and his transformation into Electro. This leads us into another plot point where Oscorp tries to cover this up and put the blame on Harry later. Whilst all this is going on, we also find that Harry has an illness that he has inherited from his father. We eventually find that in order to cure himself, Harry needs a sample of Spider-Man's blood. Spider-Man doesn't want to give it to him, however, so yeah. That adds yet another plot point where Harry hates Spider-Man, and this leads to Harry's transformation into the Green Goblin. All the whilst there is another subplot about Gwen going to Oxford, and at the same time, this movie tries to set up the Sinister Six. There, that's 12 storylines. 12 storylines, and I'm certain that I've left some out. The movie's just trying to cram in so many plot points that unfortunately, it doesn't give them the ample amount of time to be developed. And believe it or not, but the movie was actually going to have even more plot points which they ended up cutting out of the film, such as Oscorp spying on Peter since he was a kid, the surprise twist that Peter's father was really alive, and the casting of Shailene Woodley, who was going to make an appearance to set up Mary Jane. And oh yeah, that reminds me, we also had the inclusion of Felicia, aka Black Cat, so we can increase that 12 to 13. And this insane overload in plot pretty much derails everything this movie tries to do with its story. So in summary, what are my overall thoughts on the stories for each of these Spider-Man sequels? Well, Spider-Man 2 was made back in the good old days when comic book movies were able to be self-contained and didn't have to worry about setting up future sequels, and the story feels so much more complete, focused, and grand as a result. In The Amazing Spider-Man 2, however, Sony forced in so many unnecessary plot points as a means to kickstart their cinematic universe with the Sinister Six, which never ended up happening, and the story suffered heavily as a result, and it was unable to maintain focus on any of its storylines. Spider-Man Far From Home, however, is very focused with a story. It just didn't prioritize it very well. The story focused less on the incredibly engaging and rich character study that could have been, and decided to just make another high school comedy. And following the heavy events of Avengers Endgame, this felt like a massive missed opportunity, as the storytelling potential this movie had was wasted in favor of doing the same thing the first movie did. But still, when it did focus on the more heavier and emotional aspects of the story, it was done very well. So the movie with the superior story is Spider-Man 2, followed by Spider-Man Far From Home, and finally, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now, my opinions on the three Spider-Mans are mostly the same as they were in their first movies. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man is funny, but he's much more mature and has a lot of weight on his shoulders. Andrew Garfield's version has much less weight on his shoulders and plays up the more fun aspects of the hero. And then we come to Tom Holland. Now, as most of you know, I thought Tom Holland was perfect as Spider-Man in Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame. But I just found him obnoxious and annoying in Spider-Man Homecoming. And I was concerned that with the same director from Homecoming returning to direct Far From Home, that I would not like Tom Holland's Spider-Man. Well, I am glad to say that in Far From Home, he is an absolutely wonderful Spider-Man. Really, he is on par with how great he was in the MCU films that were directed by the Russo brothers. Now, each of the Spider-Mans go through very different journeys in each of their respected movies, and they each have their own fair share of problems. The major one for Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man is that he is losing his powers. Now, as much as I enjoyed watching Peter struggle with this, there is one thing I never understood. How did he lose his powers in the first place? One by one, they just start to go, and it's not explained. I thought they were going to say the effects of the spider bite he got in the first movie is wearing out of his system, and he needs to get bitten by the same spider again. But nope. They just go and then they suddenly come back. Usually superheroes need to do something in order to get rid of their powers. They don't just go and then come back when the plot demands they do. So I like the storyline, but how it happened never made sense to me. As for Garfield's Spider-Man, my thoughts for him are exactly the same as they were for the first Amazing Spider-Man. He's incredibly fun to be around, he has playful mannerisms, and I always enjoy myself whenever he's on screen. And the upbeat way he treats people, such as Max right here, is absolutely classic Spider-Man. This is the kind of excitement that you are supposed to feel when you see Spider-Man interact with the citizens, and Garfield 100% delivers on that. That being said, there is one point where he prioritizes his playful persona over the lives of innocent people, like right here for example.
Heads up, watch out! Okay, there you go. You okay?
I don't know why he is so proud of himself for saving Max here. That wasn't an empty taxi, and all of these weren't empty cars either. And to brush it off like it was nothing, that is something I would expect from Deadpool, but not Spider-Man. And then we come to Holland, and like I said, I thought he did a great job and he was very fun to watch as Spider-Man. But let me tell ya, I always thought Spider-Man 3 had the dumbest Peter Parker, but Far From Home actually swings in and takes the cake for the world's dumbest Peter Parker. Tony Stark leaves behind these Stark Tech glasses for Peter to use, which has the ability to control a lot of Stark's weapons, and after a very short while, Peter decides that he doesn't want to have the glasses anymore, and he hands them over to Quentin Beck and grants him full permissions to be the new owner. Now, the only reason they did that and decided to make Holland's Peter Parker so dumb is so that they can conveniently advance the plot, and rather than putting effort into the writing and finding a plausible way for Peter to come to this decision, they decided to go out of character and make Peter Parker so unbelievably stupid. With great power means give it all to the stranger you've known for less than a day, I guess. Did Holland's Uncle Ben teach him anything? Not to mention that in Far From Home, he pretty much didn't give a shit about with great power comes great responsibility. I get that he's struggling and wants to live a normal life, but there's no ideological struggle. His personal and noble side of his mind are not in competition with each other. It only really felt like he suited up most of the time because the teacher told him to, not because he wanted to. Oh, and strangely, by the end of the movie, Peter takes the Stark glasses and regains control over them again, even though technically Mysterio should have to grant permissions back to Peter first. But nope, the plot hole says that Peter can just take permission right back without getting the new owner's authorization first. I found that really lazy, and again, it just served as a convenient and easy out for the writers. Now, unlike Homecoming, Far From Home actually has some stakes. In the last half hour of the movie, Peter's classmates are in trouble of getting killed, and you genuinely feel like there is a ticking clock, and if Peter doesn't stop Mysterio, then his friends will die. The only problem, however, is that I knew none of them were going to die. And this brings us to an issue with Far From Home. The MCU Spider-Man movies have a real problem where they don't deal with death. Peter doesn't have any leftover sadness towards the death of his Uncle Ben in Homecoming, and in Far From Home, he doesn't even properly deal with Tony Stark's death. He has one genuinely good scene, but there was hardly any build up to it, and the scene is over in next to no time. I would have liked if this movie actually showed Peter having to deal with Stark's death throughout the whole movie, and then he emotionally breaks down and has this scene with Happy. But instead, the aftermaths of Tony Stark's death takes a back seat, and that to me is a massive missed opportunity. Peter dealing with Stark's death shouldn't have taken a back seat, it should have taken a front seat. It needed to be the emotional core of the movie, and depriving Tom Holland's Spider-Man of these emotional storylines really is depriving his character of some rich character development. And in the grand scheme of things, it makes this movie feel forgettable. Both Spider-Man 2 and The Amazing Spider-Man 2, however, actually have story elements where Peter has to deal with some really heavy and emotional stuff, and this makes for what is, in my opinion, the best scenes of the movie. Now, in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, the emotional stuff is good, but it's not great, as he pretty much gets over all of his emotional demons by the end of the film. But it was very well done in Spider-Man 2, as it gives Peter an arc throughout the movie, and this arc has a beginning, middle, and end, and it's very engaging, and when combined with the fantastic soundtrack, it's very powerful. Moving on to something a little less dramatic, Peter Parker essentially has two lives, his life as a nerdy teenager and the other as a superhero. And the latter really takes a toll on his personal life, and this usually comes with consequences. Now, the Raimi trilogy perfectly illustrated this throughout the three films, and Spider-Man 2 is no different. There are countless times where he goes through consequence after consequence, and he puts others before himself, even at the expense of his own life. So the Raimi trilogy gets his double life. The Amazing Spider-Man films didn't really have consequences for Peter's personal life, with the exception that he is in danger of dragging Gwen into trouble, but besides that, he doesn't really have to deal with much consequences. I mean, even the first Amazing Spider-Man had more consequences of his double life, but with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Peter dealing with the consequences of his double life was there, but it wasn't there as strongly as it could have been. And the MCU Spider-Man films don't deal with it at all, and this goes tenfold for Far From Home. There was not a single consequence for his personal life in this movie. I mean, apart from losing some time with MJ, he was 100% in the clear, just like he was in Spider-Man Homecoming. He never got in trouble, and he never gets punished for it. Even the recent Spider-Man PS4 game gave Peter a lot more consequences, some of which you wouldn't even think about. For example, in the very opening of the game, Peter is presented with a choice. He either pays his overdue rent or goes after the Kingpin. He chooses to go after the Kingpin, and to no one's surprise, he saves the day. But then we go back to the question of his overdue rent. Now, if it was the MCU Spider-Man films, they would have made a quick joke and let him pay his rent and keep his stuff. But in the game, he comes back home and finds that he's been evicted. And in the very next mission, Peter goes in the dead of night to try and recover some of his stuff that got thrown away during the eviction. And there you go. That is Spider-Man to me. He saves the day, and when he comes back home as Peter Parker, his life has not been put on hold while he's out there saving the day. And that's just one example of the Spider-Man PS4 game giving Peter consequences. There are so many more, and they really make you root and care for him. And in their own ways, the Sam Raimi and Mark Webb movies do the same thing. These MCU Spider-Man movies really need to start making Peter suffer consequences for having to ditch his personal life to become Spider-Man, and these movies are really lacking that. Instead, it just plays these scenes off for jokes. I mean, do you remember this scene from Homecoming?
Guys, Peter? Yeah, I was hoping maybe I could rejoin the team.
No way.
You can't just quit on us, stroll up, and be welcomed back by everyone.
Hey, welcome back, Peter. Flash, you're back to first alternate.
See, instead of suffering any consequences for quitting the team, he manages to get back on and takes his original spot back with no problems, when in actuality, the best case scenario for him at this point would be that he gets assigned to a lower rank. Stan Lee said that what makes Spider-Man different from the other superheroes is that he is very relatable. He's a kid that has a normal life which doesn't get put on hold when he suits up as Spider-Man. But that part of Peter Parker's development that Stan Lee incorporated into his character is nowhere to be found with Tom Holland's Spider-Man. Everything is easy for him, as when he saves the day as Spider-Man, his personal life is completely intact, and that never fails to disappoint me. The same goes for the relationships he has. Peter essentially befriends and trusts Mysterio, and then Mysterio betrays him, and when Peter confronts him and the final battle is over, there was no emotion there of Peter reacting to being betrayed.
You lied to me, and I trusted you.
I mean, spoilers for Spider-Man PS4, but in this game, Peter also trusts someone, and when he finds out that he betrayed him, Peter completely breaks down, and it was very effective and emotional and even heartbreaking to see him in this state. Take a look for yourself.
Peter, I saw you as a son. I should have known you'd turn on me, just like all the others.
Turn. I worshipped you, your mind, your conscience, wanting to help others, the way you never gave up. You were everything I wanted to be. You just threw it away.
You see what I mean? This is a very powerful and emotional scene, and it hits you really hard. But in Spider-Man Far From Home, they could have given us something like this with Tom Holland delivering a heartbreaking performance, but instead, they went with something that was safe and easy to film.
You lied to me, and I trusted you.
And that was a big disappointment to me. Look, all of these are great Spider-Mans. I'm not saying that Tom Holland's is bad, but Spider-Man is only as good as his story arc, as well as the challenges and tribulations he has to deal with. And although The Amazing Spider-Man 2 definitely made an attempt at presenting him with some serious challenges, only one of these movies takes its time and actually succeeds in giving him some very well developed growth when the film is over. So the sequels with a superior Spider-Man is Spider-Man 2, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and finally, not far off, is Spider-Man Far From Home. Now let's start with each of these movies' interpretations of Aunt May. Now in Spider-Man 2, she is struggling financially, and it's this struggle which makes her miss Uncle Ben even more, as he is the one who used to take care of all this stuff. And the fact that he is no longer here to support her anymore reignites the feeling of loss that both she and Peter feels about him. Now The Amazing Spider-Man 2 also does something very similar in this regard, as this Aunt May is also struggling with financial issues. And this leads to a pretty good scene where she can't contain her silence anymore and just lets it all out and tells Peter how hard things have become and how she can't cope without Ben. Now to be perfectly honest, even though her speeches can go on for too long, I really liked the Aunt May in the Raimi trilogy, but I never really liked the Aunt May in the Amazing Spider-Man films. I just never got emotionally attached to her, and I always find her very forgettable. That being said, she might actually get a pass and not be considered the worst Aunt May this time round, because the Aunt May in Spider-Man Far From Home had little to no involvement at all. And I have to question why they decided to do this, because we got that big last-minute reveal at the end of Homecoming where she finds out that Peter is Spider-Man. You'd think that they would actually address this or have them talk about it, but no. She's just okay with it, and that's pretty much it. We don't get anything else. It would have been nice to see them have a conversation about it or something. I mean, why set up such a big character change like that and then just do nothing with it? You'd think that Aunt May finding out Peter is Spider-Man would be a big deal, but it really isn't. It's just boring. And not to mention that in this movie, she is only used as a comedic device, and although some of the jokes are funny, it doesn't give you anything deep or meaningful to attach to. The Aunt Mays in Spider-Man 2 and The Amazing Spider-Man 2 did, or in The Amazing Spider-Man's case, it tried, but Far From Home just seemed completely disinterested in trying, and as a result, they've made my rating for Aunt May very easy. So the movie that has the superior Aunt May is Spider-Man 2, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and finally, Spider-Man Far From Home. Although, you gotta give her some credit. How she is able to pay the electric bills for Peter powering his Stark suit, I will never know. And now it's time to move on to the love interests. It's time to talk about Mary Jane, Gwen Stacy, and MJ. And we are going to start with Mary Jane. Now, Kirsten Dunst is a really talented actress, but the character of Mary Jane is just a terrible person. First off, she acts like one big tease. Pretty much at the beginning of the movie, when Peter's birthday party is over, she waits outside for him to show up, she talks about how much she misses him, she then touches his face, and then despite sending mixed messages, suddenly out of nowhere, she says this.
I'm seeing somebody now.
You mean like a boyfriend?
Well, like, I like him. What?
What? I'm positive that I'm not the only one who's seeing this. She's being very manipulative here. Rather than telling Peter that she likes him, she decides to say she's seeing someone instead. And this is where her character loses all credibility as a decent human being. Because all she does with her newfound boyfriend is use him as a means to an end so she can emotionally blackmail Peter for not going out with her. And she does her very best to take advantage of every moment she can to throw it in Peter's face. She later on has one of many heated conversations with Peter saying that she's in a relationship and that she's getting married.
You want to get some chow mein?
Peter, I'm getting married.
So she won't have a meal with him, but she has no problem calling him into a restaurant so she can ask him if he loves her. And then she asks him for a kiss. Yep. When he asks her if she wants to go out for a meal, she makes it out like that's crossing the line, but kissing someone while she's engaged, that's not crossing the line at all. And by far, the worst thing she did in this movie is when she ran out of her wedding and left the groom at the altar all by himself in front of their entire family. Now, the first time I watched this movie, I was 8 years old, and at that age, you don't really care about other characters in movies. So long as the main characters are happy, that's all that matters. But even I looked at what she did and was like, why did you do that? That guy doesn't deserve that. Look at him. He is absolutely devastated. Am I supposed to be rooting for her in this moment? Look at her happily running away and leaving him there all alone. She clearly doesn't give a shit. And why did she have to dump him on the wedding day and publicly announce that she left him in front of his entire family? They're all in here. Instead of dumping him in this shitty way and humiliating him, why didn't she leave him a few days before or something? Why did she have to leave it to the last minute? And she didn't even give him the decency of telling him to his face. She just left him a note which he read out in front of everyone, and that's it. He's never going to see her again. Just recently, when she was kidnapped, he was most likely scared shitless for her, and she repays his concern like this. She just used him throughout this whole entire movie as a means to an end to get to Peter. She even went as far as to agree to marry him, and when she had no more use for him, she hung him out to dry. What an absolutely evil and disgusting individual. If you ask me, she is the real monster of these movies, because whereas all of these villains are not in full control of their minds, very much like Jekyll and Hyde, Mary Jane is in full control of her mind, and she did all of this on her own accord. And out of all the Raimi Spider-Man movies, she is the most despicable in Spider-Man 2.
I don't think it's that simple.
Of course you don't, because you complicate things.
He complicates things. Look, I'll admit that even Peter goes back and forth, but he is a downright saint with this relationship compared to the piece of work that Mary Jane is. And then we have MJ, and I really don't understand why the movie went so over the top in making her socially awkward. I mean, take a look at this scene.
You look really pretty.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You look pretty too.
Now, does this joke sound familiar to you?
You look beautiful.
Thank you. You look beautiful as well.
Now, my problem with this is that the movie is trying to say that MJ is socially awkward when compared to the rest of the kids, but I think they just went way too far with it. 7 of 9 from Voyager was assimilated as a little girl and was controlled and raised by the Borg all her life, so it makes sense for her to be socially awkward. But MJ has had a fairly normal upbringing, and as we have seen in Homecoming, is social enough to be surrounded by a normal group of kids her age, so to make her this socially awkward is just the movie's attempt at going way too over the top with its humor. Now, that doesn't mean the relationship in Far From Home is bad. I mean, from Peter's very first scene, he is suddenly infatuated with her, which felt very sudden, but aside from that, his relationship with MJ is very basic and simple, and it was done well enough to the point that you cared, unlike the relationship in Spider-Man 2. Now, the relationship between Peter and Gwen in the Amazing Spider-Man movies is actually pretty good when compared to other superhero romances, although having him break up with her just so they can get back together again was just unnecessary and took up time that the movie didn't have. But you still get the feeling that they care for each other, and it does culminate with that final death scene, which in all honesty did not need to happen this early on. But having said that, it was pretty damn effective, and I really did care. But yeah, despite some unnecessary road bumps, Gwen Stacy is a much more memorable and enjoyable character than the rest of the love interests. She's not manipulative like Mary Jane, she's not an exaggerated shutoff like MJ, and she actually helps Peter take out the villain of the movie. She even did the same thing in the first Amazing Spider-Man. So his relationship with Gwen Stacy is flawed, but as far as the character goes, Gwen Stacy is a very likable love interest. So the movie with the superior love interest is The Amazing Spider-Man 2, followed by Spider-Man Far From Home, and finally, Spider-Man 2. Now, the action in Spider-Man 2 really stepped it up when compared to the first film. The action was super fast paced and it showcased a lot more of Spider-Man's acrobatic moves. The action scene that stands out to me is the train sequence. It starts with a triumphant return of our hero, which is combined with some amazing music, and it does all kinds of cool stuff to make this fight as interesting as possible. And to this day, the action scenes still hold up incredibly well. And the scenes where the mechanical arms come to life and start brutally murdering the doctors, this feels like something taken directly out of a horror movie. You see, for those that say, well, this is a Spider-Man movie, you can't go too dark with it, Spider-Man 2 says bullshit. Marvel is capable of pulling off some dark stuff, and it not only resulted in making the villain scary, but it made for an awesome action scene, one that we don't usually see in a comic book movie, let alone one that is rated PG. And to put that in perspective, Spider-Man Homecoming was rated at 12, which is the equivalent to a PG-13. So yeah, the action in Spider-Man 2 is great, and it really stepped up in quality from the first movie. As for the action in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, it was also really well done. The choreography is always interesting, the cinematography is great, and they are a lot of fun to watch. The standout action scene to me is the fight with the Goblin. The incredibly fast pace, the way it was shot, and the music that played during this scene, and the fact that there were stakes during this particular fight made it very intense, and I really enjoyed it. Although the whole plane tragedy that was simultaneously going on during the fight against Electro in the climax was unnecessary bloat. Especially the absolutely poor excuse it made to somehow include Aunt May. Her inclusion felt like it was only here to give you the impression that the film is including all of our characters in the big final battle, and although it's not necessarily a bad idea, it wasn't executed well. And speaking of execution, I only have one major problem with the action scenes in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and that is that they aren't particularly memorable. But that doesn't dismiss the fact that they are still a lot of fun to sit through. Now, Spider-Man Far From Home has 3 main action scenes. You have the water monster, the fire monster, and the final climactic battle. And to be honest, I thought the first 2 battles were pretty lame. When you take into account how creative action scenes in comic book movies have become over the last decade, these were very slow and just all around unimpressive. I actually found myself wanting the action scenes to be over so we could get back to the rest of the film. Now, that being said, the final action scene in the movie's climax I thought was a big improvement over the lackluster action in the rest of the movie. It was fun, energetic, and even creative in certain parts. And even before that, the action scene where Mysterio uses a ton of holograms and special effects on Spider-Man was downright amazing. It honestly felt like a completely different director took over, and that was by far the most creative set piece of the whole movie. Besides that though, I still think most of the action involving Spider-Man in Far From Home is very underwhelming. And when you take into account how amazing and memorable the action was in Spider-Man 2, a film that was made 15 years ago, that isn't a good look for Spider-Man Far From Home. So the movies with the superior action is Spider-Man 2, followed by The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and finally, Spider-Man Far From Home. Alright, the villains. Now in Spider-Man 2 we have Dr. Octopus, and despite coming off as a mad genius, you do feel sorry for him whenever he breaks free of the influence of the arms. Speaking of which, the mechanical arms to this day look absolutely amazing, and that's down to the fact that they are made with a combination of CGI and practical effects. And it really pays off because 15 years later, they still look just as good as they did back then. And once Octavius goes all evil, he becomes very creepy and intimidating. And not to mention that he has the best and most iconic villainous scene out of any Spider-Man movie. And they use these arms in a couple of other horror scenarios, and it really works. The only annoying thing about it is that all the women in this movie, they scream so unjustifiably loud. I don't get why the women are screaming so loud in this movie whenever they see Dr. Octopus. This woman in particular always used to get on my nerves as a kid. It's like she is trying to scream as loud as she can. Oh no, a metal claw just broke through the wall. Come on, woman. Even people in agonizing pain don't scream this loud. But yeah, Dr. Octopus was a really cool villain, and his appearance, the use of his mechanical arms, it has been executed so well. Next, we have Mysterio. Now, Mysterio was portrayed as the good guy in the film's marketing, and this was just downright stupid. Everyone knows that Mysterio is a villain, and I don't know who Marvel thought they were fooling by keeping this under wraps. I honestly think that the secret keeping for Avengers Endgame has gotten to their heads. I mean, you don't even have to read a Spider-Man comic. If you've seen any of the illustrations, then you know that Mysterio is a villain. But my little rant aside, Mysterio is a cool villain. He does a good job of fooling everyone, besides us, that he is here to help. And when he drops the act and we find out that he was really a fake the whole time, I really enjoyed this scene and I found it very clever the way the movie incorporated both him and one of his accomplices from the first Iron Man movie. But that being said, I think the execution could have been way better. The main reason is because Mysterio starts explaining his whole entire backstory and motivation to his team, and then he starts pointing at his teammates individually and tells them about their own backstories, as well as explaining why they decided to join him, even though everyone in that room already knows all of this. And the reason he does this whole explanation is not because of his teammates, it was for us who are watching this movie, and the way it dumps out all of this exposition to us was kind of silly. The scene itself was still very interesting though, and I really enjoyed it. And I find it funny how even though he is dead, Stark is the gift that keeps on giving. As it turns out, Mysterio is yet another villain that he created. In Homecoming it was Vulture, and now it's Mysterio. And it's because of Mysterio that the world now knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And yes, we will definitely be talking about that mid-credit scene later. Now, both Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man Far From Home only have one villain. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, however, decides to incorporate 3 villains. Clearly, Sony learned nothing from Spider-Man 3. Now, in all fairness, Rhino doesn't really count, as he's only here to set his character up for future sequels, which are never gonna happen. So that leaves both Electro and the Green Goblin as our villains. Now, Electro starts out as a nerd called Max Dillon, who just so happens to be a big fan of Spider-Man. Unfortunately, he has an accident at his job at Oscorp one day, and he gets transformed into Electro. And pretty much by the flick of a switch, he goes from being a fan of Spider-Man to an enemy. How, you ask? Well, Max sees himself garnering attention from the city, and very shortly after, the screens move their attention to Spider-Man. He suddenly accuses Spider-Man of being a liar for some reason, and calls him selfish, because he thinks that Spider-Man set him up as a means to garner more attention from the city, and apparently, that is the motivation the movie gives him to justify killing Spider-Man. The movie is in fact so proud of this that later on, when Harry says to him that they can be friends, Electro is given this bit of dramatic dialogue.
I had a friend once. It didn't work out.
Yeah, that's some deep dialogue right there. Spider-Man wasn't even your friend, you moron. So yeah, that's pretty much how they set up Electro. And I gotta say, this is one of the worst villain motivations I have ever seen. All the other villains in the Spider-Man movies, even the bad ones, are at the very least given understandable motivations that make sense. But Electro's backstory, honestly, just feels like an afterthought. Like they couldn't be bothered to come up with one, so by the time they got to his transformation, they just made him evil on the spot. And it's just pitiful. And do you know what's worse? After his little introduction scene, Electro spends the rest of the movie locked up in a lab. A lab where they tried to experiment on him, I guess, and they actually hurt him by zapping him with electricity. Yeah, you figure that one out. And then he gets to fight Spider-Man in the film's climax where he dies and we never hear from him again. So yeah, Electro only really has 2 scenes of consequence with Spider-Man in the entire movie, and he's out of commission in the rest of the film. So he's a villain that visually looks cool, but there's no substance behind him. He's underused and criminally sidelined. And then we have Harry. Now, Harry is suffering from a disease which has been passed down to him by his father, Norman Osborn. Now, you'd think that this disease would start to get passed down to Harry and reach its full effect when he reaches his father's age, but nope, the disease is in full effect and Harry is apparently going to die any day now. And his only hope is for his childhood friend Peter to contact Spider-Man so Harry can take a sample of his blood, as it can apparently save him. Why? Well, this way the movie can force the motivation for Harry to become the Green Goblin, because Spider-Man says, "No, I am not going to give you my blood," and Harry becomes angry and revenge driven. And yeah, that's the second villain's motivation. They both suck, don't they? I mean, geez, Electro's motivation is forced, but I at the very least understand why he was chosen to be in the movie, but why on earth did they put Harry in the movie? If you take his whole storyline out of this film, then it would have given the movie more time to focus on Electro. But no, by including Harry and having to develop him, the movie just pushes Electro off to the side until the final act of the film. I can talk for hours on end about how bad The Amazing Spider-Man 2 utilizes its villains, but I'm not going to. I'll just say this. Out of the 3 Spider-Man sequels, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 by far has the worst villains. Both Spider-Man 2 and Far From Home have only one villain, and they are very well developed, have great motivations, and they are interesting in their own ways. Both villains in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, however, are just downright pitiful in comparison. They are very poorly written, and have just been shoved into the movie with little to no thought behind them. So the movie with the superior villains is Spider-Man 2, followed by Spider-Man Far From Home, and finally, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So when you get down to it, all of these movies are products of their time. Spider-Man 2 was made back in the good old days where a comic book movie could stand on its own and still feel big without having several films set it up first. And it was able to tell a complete story without blatantly leaving it open for future movies. And it made you leave feeling complete. And sadly, you don't get that with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, as it did nothing but set stuff up. And as for Far From Home, it could have been a great movie if it committed to the devastating events of Endgame and had Peter deal with it like we are, but it just ended up being like the rest of the Marvel movies that are not directed by the Russo brothers. A fun pastime, but ultimately disposable. And it didn't have to be. It could have been a much smarter film, but it ended up being kind of ridiculous instead. And as much as I enjoyed watching the film, it's this disposable nature of the Marvel movies that has me worried for the next Spider-Man film, because without the smart and deep writing, the situation he is in is not going to be much of a problem at all, and it will be dealt with in an underwhelming way. Going back to The Amazing Spider-Man 2, its biggest problem is the ridiculous amount of plot points that it unnecessarily tries to shove into the story, and as well as getting in the way of our characters being developed, it also gets in the way of our villains' development. And not to mention that The Amazing Spider-Man 2, much like the first movie, had advertised so many scenes in the trailer that didn't even end up in the movie. I mean, it was bad enough the first time, but the second time, that is inexcusable. Sony should honestly stop this. It is false advertising and a cheap way of getting audiences to come and see the movie. And if Sony thinks this stuff would actually make people interested in watching the film, then instead of pretending that it's in the movie, why don't they actually put it in the movie? It just shows how much Sony have no clue as to what they're doing. But they're not the only ones. Far From Home also pulls some shit like this. This scene right here is not even in the film, and I was really looking forward to watching the whole scene. Why would they cut something like this out? It really makes no sense, and I expect better from Marvel. It's time for the scores. Spider-Man 2 gets a 7 out of 10, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 gets a 5 out of 10, and Spider-Man Far From Home gets an above average 6. The reason Spider-Man 2 loses 3 points is because the movie feels longer than it actually is, and the romance between Peter and Mary Jane, which takes up a big part of the film, is so painful and horrible to sit through, and that is enough to take the movie's score down by 3 points. And The Amazing Spider-Man 2 just tries to do so much stuff, and it ultimately fails at all of them. Heck, this Peter Parker didn't even get to find his uncle's killer. He's still out there somewhere. And as for the soundtrack for all 3 films, well, Spider-Man 2 was composed by Danny Elfman, and this is when he was back in his prime, and the music is absolutely fantastic. It is emotional when it needs to be, it's intense when it needs to be, it's tension-filled when it needs to be, and it's even epic when it needs to be. And yeah, I don't have a single problem with the soundtrack for Spider-Man 2. To this day, the Raimi Spider-Man movies have the best and most iconic music out of all the different interpretations of Spider-Man. As for the soundtrack in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, it is composed by one of the best and most consistent composers working today, Hans Zimmer. Now, there are a lot of people out there who absolutely hate the soundtrack for Amazing Spider-Man 2. I, on the other hand, don't get it. The Spider-Man theme, although not great, is still quite memorable, and it fits this interpretation of the character very well. And the music during the action scenes is great. The electric guitar and heavy bass music for Electro is very catchy, and the romantic music between Peter and Gwen is my favorite piece from the entire film. And the emotional music, particularly during Gwen's death, was absolute perfection. The only reason that I can gather as to why people despise the soundtrack is because they don't like the words that are being said during Electro's theme song. And after that, they just dismiss the whole soundtrack and say it's terrible. Now yeah, even I admit that the words during Electro's theme song didn't all fit, but I don't think that is reason alone to declare that the rest of the soundtrack is terrible, as I think there is lots of great music in this film. And as for the soundtrack in Spider-Man Far From Home, I thought it was much better than Spider-Man Homecoming, but it absolutely pales in comparison to the music in both Spider-Man 2 and The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Really, the music in Far From Home isn't all that. But I'll tell you what is all that: the mid-credit scene. It was amazing, and I can't wait to see how they pay it off. The end credit scene, though, almost made me take a whole entire point away from the movie. It really wasn't needed, and it completely changes the rest of the movie. I thought that Nick Fury was supposed to be embarking on a journey with Spider-Man. Instead, we find out that Spider-Man wasn't really working with Nick Fury the whole time, and instead he was working with the Skrulls. And the movie just shrugs it off like Marvel movies usually do. It treats it like a joke, and shows that the real Nick Fury is off on holiday somewhere. People seem to be so preoccupied with the fact that Marvel surprised them with this little twist, rather than thinking why they did it and what it amounted to, and there really is no reason for it. So the mid-credit scene was truly amazing, but that end credit scene really ruined things about this movie that I genuinely liked. And it all goes back to the problem that Marvel just don't know when to stop the freaking jokes, and they will include them even at the expense of storytelling and character development. And it's stupid narrative-based changes like this which makes me concerned for the next Spider-Man movie, because if the Russo brothers are not involved, then Marvel don't have a clue how to pull off a really good story, and you need that in order for the next Spider-Man film to succeed. Heck, you needed it for this film to fully succeed. And above all, Far From Home suffers from just feeling like a couple of chapters of a story rather than a full, complete story. And the excuse is usually, well, Endgame came out and now we need something lighthearted and fun. Well, you can have something lighthearted and fun, but the story should not have to suffer for that. Go with that excuse all you want, but my biggest complaint with the two MCU Spider-Man films is that they just feel like pastimes, and they don't feel like important comic book events that you must see, like the Dark Knight trilogy, Joker, most of the X-Men movies, Logan, Deadpool, The Winter Soldier, Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame. The Spider-Man movies feel very flat and inconsequential, and they should feel like they hold more merit than that, but unfortunately, they don't. So, I like all of these Spider-Man movies in different ways, but they all have their problems, and I don't think any of them are perfect. But the one that is undeniably the best is Spider-Man 2. The story is the best, the action is the best, and yes, even the special effects are the best. The way they are implemented using a combination of computer and practical effects gives the movie a timeless aesthetic, whereas both The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and Far From Home are done with a lot of obvious CGI, and when stacked up against Spider-Man 2, they don't even come close to the excellent level of craftsmanship. And out of all three movies, Spider-Man 2, without a shadow of a doubt, will stand the test of time. So that's it for another Versus video, and guess what? I have just recently passed 50,000 subscribers. Thank you so much guys for your continuous patience and support. I have never stopped appreciating it. I have plenty more Versus videos on the way, and I have also started to create short podcasts on my Patreon page. So if you want to hear extra reviews from me and coverage of the new Disney Plus shows, then feel free to claim any of the perks and you will be able to gain access to my ever-growing list of podcasts. And in the meantime, I'm off to work on more Versus videos. Thanks again so much for continuing to watch my videos guys, I really appreciate it, and I will see all of you next time. Take care.